Right now, a partial victory for former President Donald Trump. He is going to appear on Michigan's primary election ballot. The state Supreme Court made that ruling, which is the opposite of one that was issued earlier this month by Colorado's Supreme Court. Judges in Colorado pointed to a clause in the 14th Amendment, and it's meant to keep Americans from holding office if they've committed insurrection or rebellion. Now, those judges cited the January 6th Capitol riots in D.C. in 2021, and some analysts told us that could fire up independents in Georgia and cause them to be sympathetic to Trump.
I'm not for the judiciary holding people accountable for their actions, but Donald Trump hasn't been convicted of anything at this juncture. People around him have been. There are cases pending against him, but until those cases are resolved, the judiciary should not be weighing in on who should be on the ballot.
Meanwhile, Colorado's Republican Party is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to get involved and intervene as it tries to get former President Donald Trump on the state's primary ballot.